Okay, buckle up, because you're in for a ride. This is a story about the most ridiculous, infuriating, and ultimately satisfying situation I've ever experienced. I'm posting this because, honestly, I need to vent, but also because the resolution was so sweet I just have to share. My name is Imani Johnson, and I live in a relatively upscale, but painfully cookie-cutter, suburban neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. I've been here for 5 years, ever since I landed a sweet promotion at my tech company. Honestly, I love my house. It's got a decent-sized yard, is close to work, and most importantly, has a beautiful in-ground pool in the backyard. It's my oasis, my escape, my go-to spot for relaxation after a long day wrestling with code and corporate nonsense. I work hard for what I have, and that pool is a tangible representation of that hard work. The trouble started brewing last Saturday. The sun was blazing, the birds were chirping, and I decided it was the perfect day for a solo swim. I put on my favorite floral print swimsuit, grabbed a chilled glass of lemonade, and headed out back. I spent a blissful couple of hours floating around, listening to music, and generally soaking up the sun. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, and the air began to cool, I decided to call it a day. I swam a final lap, climbed out, and started the process of covering the pool. Now, covering the pool is a bit of a ritual. It involves unfurling the large, solar cover, carefully aligning it, and then securing it with the weighted water tubes. It's not exactly rocket science, but it takes some time and attention to detail. I was about halfway through the process when I noticed someone watching me. Standing at the edge of my property, separated only by a low decorative fence, was a woman. She was older, probably in her late 50s, with that perfectly coiffed blonde hair and perpetually pinched expression that seems to be a hallmark of a certain type of suburbanite. I recognized her instantly. It was Deborah Miller, the president of the HOA and self-appointed guardian of all things Willow Creek Estates. I gave her a polite nod and a small wave, trying to signal that I was busy. "Afternoon, Deborah," I called out, hoping she would just wave back and move on. No such luck. She remained rooted to the spot, her eyes narrowed, her lips pursed. A bad feeling started to creep into my gut. I knew this was going to be one of those encounters. "Imani, isn't it?" she said, her voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that did nothing to mask the underlying disapproval. "Yes, Deborah. Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. I really just wanted to finish covering my pool and go inside. "Well," she drawled, drawing out the word as if she were savoring it, "I was just wondering why you're closing the pool so early. It's barely evening." I bit back a sigh. "Here we go. I'm done swimming for the day, and I like to cover it to keep the leaves and debris out," I explained, keeping my voice even. "It keeps the water cleaner, and it helps retain heat." Deborah's eyes scanned my yard, her gaze lingering on the meticulously manicured lawn and the colorful flower beds. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to find something, anything, to criticize. "I just think it's a shame to cover it up when there's still so much daylight left," she said, finally settling on a complaint. "It's such a lovely pool. It adds so much to the neighborhood aesthetic." I internally rolled my eyes. The neighborhood aesthetic. Of course. I swear, that woman lived and breathed property values. "I appreciate that, Deborah, but it's my pool, and I'm choosing to cover it," I said, finally allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. "I'm sure you understand." She didn't understand, of course. Her face tightened even further, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she searched for a way to prolong the conversation, to exert her perceived authority. "Well, I just hope you're not planning on keeping it covered all the time," she said, her voice laced with a warning. "The HOA has rules about maintaining appearances, you know." And that was when I knew, deep down, that this was far from over. This wasn't just about a pool cover. This was about something else entirely. I finished covering the pool, ignoring Deborah's lingering presence, and went inside, my good mood thoroughly soured. I tried to shake it off, but her words kept replaying in my head. Maintaining appearances. It was such a loaded phrase, especially coming from her. I'd experienced enough microaggressions in my life to recognize the subtle, yet unmistakable, scent of racism clinging to her words. It wasn't just about the pool. It was about me, about my presence in a neighborhood where, let's be honest, I didn't exactly fit the mold. I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner, turning up the music, and focusing on something other than the passive-aggressive encounter. But the uneasy feeling persisted. I had a nagging sense that Deborah wasn't going to let it go. And, unfortunately, I was right. About an hour later, as I was settling down on the couch to watch a movie, I heard a knock at the door. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home. But I knew that wouldn't make it go away. Whoever was on the other side of that door would just keep knocking, or worse, escalate the situation. I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and opened the door. Standing there, flanked by 2 police officers, was Deborah Miller. My heart sank. "Good evening, Imani," she said, her voice dripping with that same saccharine sweetness, but this time, there was a distinct edge of triumph in her eyes. "I'm afraid we have a bit of a situation here." I looked past her to the officers, trying to gauge their expressions. They seemed uncomfortable, almost embarrassed. "Ma'am, we received a call about a disturbance," one of the officers said, his voice apologetic. "Ms. Miller here reported a possible, suspicious activity." I turned my gaze back to Deborah, my anger simmering just below the surface. "Suspicious activity? What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well," Deborah said, feigning innocence, "I was just concerned. Imani has been covering her pool for hours now, and I haven't seen her, or anyone else, go outside. It's just unusual. And, frankly, a little concerning." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She had called the police because I covered my pool and stayed inside my own house. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. "Deborah, are you serious?" I said, my voice rising in disbelief. "You called the police because I covered my pool? I live here. This is my house." The officers shifted uncomfortably. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we understand your frustration, but we have to follow up on all reports," he said. "We just need to ask you a few questions to make sure everything is okay." I took a deep breath, trying to regain control of my emotions. I knew that getting angry wouldn't help. I needed to stay calm, to explain the situation clearly and rationally. "Of course, officer," I said, turning my attention to them. "There's nothing suspicious going on. I covered my pool because I was finished swimming. I came inside to relax and watch a movie. That's it. That's the extent of the suspicious activity." The officers nodded, their expressions softening. They clearly understood how ridiculous the situation was. "We appreciate your cooperation, ma'am," one of them said. "We just need to confirm a few things." And then, to my surprise, one of the officers turned to Deborah. "Ms. Miller, do you have any evidence to support your claim of suspicious activity?" Deborah stammered, her face flushing red. "Well, no, not exactly," she said. "It's just a feeling I had." The officer raised an eyebrow. "A feeling," he repeated. "That's it." The other officer stepped forward. "Ms. Miller, we understand your concern for the neighborhood, but calling 911 based on a feeling is not appropriate," he said, his voice firm. "It wastes valuable resources and can potentially put people in danger. We need to have reasonable suspicion of a crime before we can investigate." I watched as Deborah's face contorted in a mixture of anger and embarrassment. She clearly hadn't expected the officers to push back against her. She thought she could use them to harass me, to intimidate me, but it had backfired spectacularly. The officers, after a few more questions, mostly aimed at defusing the situation and making sure I was genuinely okay, turned their attention back to Deborah. The lead officer, a tall, imposing man named Officer Reynolds, asked her a few pointed questions about why she felt the need to call 911 based on so little evidence. Deborah sputtered and stammered, trying to justify her actions, but the officers weren't buying it. Then, Officer Reynolds said something that completely floored me. "Ms. Miller, while we're here, we need to run a routine background check on all parties involved," he stated matter-of-factly. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I had nothing to hide. I'm a law-abiding citizen with a clean record. But the thought of having my background checked, of having my entire life scrutinized because of Deborah's baseless accusations, still felt incredibly invasive. But then I looked at Deborah. Her face had gone pale. Her hands were shaking. She opened her mouth to protest, but Officer Reynolds cut her off. "It's standard procedure, ma'am," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We just need to verify your identity and make sure there are no outstanding warrants or anything of that nature." The officers took down our information and retreated to their patrol car to run the check. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Deborah stood there, fidgeting, her eyes darting around nervously. I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. She had tried to use the police to harass me, and now, she was the one being investigated. While we waited, the other officer, a younger woman named Officer Jones, struck up a conversation with me. She was incredibly apologetic for the situation and made it clear that they didn't condone Deborah's actions. She even admitted that they received a disproportionate number of calls from this neighborhood, often involving petty disputes and complaints. Then, she asked me a question that made me pause. "Ms. Johnson, are you familiar with the HOA regulations regarding pool maintenance?" I frowned. "Yes, I've read them," I replied. "I'm pretty sure I'm in compliance with everything." Officer Jones hesitated for a moment, then continued. "Just out of curiosity, do you remember anything specific about pool cover regulations, or any clauses that might relate to the frequency of pool usage?" I thought for a moment, racking my brain. I remembered reading through the HOA documents when I first moved in, but it had been a while. "I don't recall anything specific," I said. "But I can check again." Officer Jones nodded. "It might be worth taking a look," she said. "Sometimes, these HOA regulations can be ambiguous." The officers came back from their patrol car a few minutes later. Officer Reynolds approached Deborah, his expression grim. "Ms. Miller," he said, his voice low, "we need to step aside for a moment." He led her away from the door, towards the edge of my property, and they began to speak in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see Deborah's face growing increasingly agitated. She gestured wildly, her voice rising in pitch. Whatever the officers had found, it wasn't good. Officer Jones stayed behind, standing near my door. She looked at me with a knowing expression. "Ms. Johnson," she said quietly, "I think you might want to familiarize yourself with Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph B of the HOA regulations. Specifically, the section regarding abuse of authority and misuse of community resources." I stared at her, confused. What was she implying? What had the background check revealed about Deborah? And what did it have to do with the HOA regulations? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I couldn't quite grasp the whole picture. Officer Reynolds returned, his expression unreadable. He addressed Deborah, his voice firm but controlled. "Ms. Miller, we're going to have to ask you to come down to the station with us to answer a few more questions," he said. Deborah's eyes widened in horror. "What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong," she protested, her voice shrill. "We believe you may have misused community resources and abused your position as HOA president," Officer Reynolds replied. "We need to investigate further." I watched in stunned silence as the officers placed Deborah in handcuffs and led her away. The triumph I felt was quickly replaced by a sense of disbelief. What on earth had she done? Officer Jones, who had remained behind, turned to me with a sympathetic smile. "Ms. Johnson, I know this has been a stressful situation," she said. "But I think you'll find that things are about to get a lot better." She explained that the background check had revealed a pattern of complaints against Deborah for misusing her position as HOA president. Apparently, she had a history of harassing residents, selectively enforcing HOA regulations, and using community funds for personal expenses. The 911 call had been the final straw. Calling the police based on a fabricated suspicion was a clear abuse of power and a waste of taxpayer money. It had also exposed Deborah's other transgressions, revealing a web of shady dealings and unethical behavior. After the police left, I went inside and immediately pulled up the HOA regulations online. I found Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph B, just as Officer Jones had suggested. The language was dense and legalistic, but the gist of it was clear. Any HOA member who abuses their authority, misuses community resources, or engages in harassment or discrimination is subject to disciplinary action, including removal from their position. I spent the next few days gathering evidence to support my claims against Deborah. I spoke to other neighbors who had experienced similar harassment from her. I collected emails, letters, and documented instances of her discriminatory behavior. It turned out that I wasn't the only one who had been targeted. Many other residents, particularly those from minority groups, had faced unfair treatment and selective enforcement of HOA regulations. We all decided to band together and demand Deborah's removal from her position as HOA president. A week later, the HOA held a special meeting to address the allegations against Deborah Miller. The meeting was packed with residents, many of whom were eager to share their experiences. The atmosphere was tense, but there was also a sense of hope and determination in the air. I presented my evidence, along with the testimonies of other residents. We detailed Deborah's pattern of harassment, her misuse of funds, and her discriminatory behavior. Deborah, who was present at the meeting, vehemently denied all the allegations. She claimed that she was being unfairly targeted, and that her actions were always in the best interests of the community. But her arguments fell flat. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the testimonies of her victims were compelling. After hours of debate and deliberation, the HOA board voted overwhelmingly to remove Deborah Miller from her position as president. She was also barred from holding any future leadership positions within the HOA. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Justice had finally been served. The removal of Deborah Miller from her position as HOA president was a watershed moment for Willow Creek Estate. It signaled a shift in the community, a rejection of the discriminatory practices that had been allowed to fester for too long. In the weeks and months that followed, the HOA underwent a complete overhaul. New leadership was elected, and new policies were implemented to ensure fairness and transparency. The new HOA board made a concerted effort to reach out to residents who had been marginalized and disenfranchised under Deborah's leadership. They actively sought input from diverse groups and worked to create a more inclusive and welcoming community. They organized neighborhood events that celebrated diversity and promoted understanding. They also revised the HOA regulations to eliminate any ambiguity or potential for discriminatory enforcement. One of the first things the new HOA board did was to address the issue of pool cover regulations. They clarified the rules to make it clear that residents had the right to cover their pools whenever they chose, without fear of harassment or reprisal. They also implemented a system for resolving disputes fairly and impartially, ensuring that all residents were treated with respect and dignity. The atmosphere in Willow Creek Estates began to change. Neighbors started to talk to each other, to get to know each other, to build genuine relationships. The sense of suspicion and distrust that had permeated the community under Deborah's reign slowly began to dissipate. People started to feel more comfortable expressing themselves, sharing their cultures, and celebrating their differences. I personally felt a huge weight lifted off my shoulders. I no longer felt like I was being watched or judged. I could finally relax and enjoy my home without fear of harassment or discrimination. I even started to feel a sense of pride in my community, knowing that we had come together to overcome adversity and create a better place for everyone. I also made some new friends in the process. I connected with other residents who had been targeted by Deborah, and we formed a support group to share our experiences and offer each other encouragement. We organized community events, volunteered for local charities, and worked together to promote positive change. We became a force for good in the neighborhood, demonstrating that diversity and inclusion were strengths, not weaknesses. The incident with Deborah Miller, as horrible as it was, ultimately brought our community closer together. It forced us to confront our biases, to challenge our assumptions, and to work towards a more just and equitable society. It taught us the importance of standing up for what is right, of speaking out against injustice, and of holding those in power accountable for their actions. The legal ramifications for Deborah Miller didn't end with her removal from the HOA. The police investigation into her misuse of community funds uncovered a significant amount of evidence of fraud and embezzlement. She was eventually charged with multiple felonies, including theft, fraud, and abuse of power. I attended the trial, along with several other residents who had been victimized by her actions. We testified about the harassment, discrimination, and financial irregularities we had witnessed. The prosecution presented a compelling case, and the jury found Deborah guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to several years in prison, as well as ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and to the residents she had harmed. It was a satisfying conclusion to a long and arduous ordeal. While no amount of punishment could fully undo the damage she had caused, it sent a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. But the real victory wasn't just about Deborah's punishment. It was about the transformation of Willow Creek Estates into a more inclusive and equitable community. It was about the empowerment of residents who had previously felt silenced and marginalized. It was about the creation of a space where everyone felt valued, respected, and safe. One sunny afternoon, a few months after Deborah's trial, I decided to take a dip in my pool. The water was crystal clear, the sun was shining, and the birds were singing. As I floated on my back, gazing up at the sky, I couldn't help but smile. I thought about everything that had happened, about the challenges we had faced, and about the progress we had made. I thought about Deborah Miller, now behind bars, and I felt a sense of closure. But more importantly, I thought about my neighbors, about the friends I had made, and about the vibrant community we had built together. I realized that Deborah's actions had ultimately backfired. She had tried to divide us, to intimidate us, to silence us. But instead, she had brought us closer together, strengthened our resolve, and inspired us to create a better world. As I climbed out of the pool, I noticed a group of children playing in the park across the street. They were laughing, running, and chasing each other, completely oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in our neighborhood. They were just kids, enjoying the sunshine and the simple pleasures of life. And I knew that, because of the changes we had made, they would grow up in a more accepting and tolerant community. A place where everyone was welcome, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or background. That, I realized, was the sweetest justice of all. Not just the punishment of Deborah Miller, but the creation of a community where everyone had the opportunity to thrive. And as I walked back into my house, dripping wet but filled with a sense of peace and contentment, I knew that I had finally found my place in Willow Creek Estate. Not just as a homeowner, but as a member of a community that was truly committed to justice, equality, and inclusion. And that, more than anything, made me feel like I was finally home.